What happened? Oh, I think oh, okay, it's recording. Sorry. Okay, we can start. Sorry. Okay. Do you want to maybe introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So my name's Andrew Likoudis. I'm a writer slash editor. Um, I deal mostly in the history of Eastern Orthodox Catholic relations and the field of traditionalism, church authority, and the magisterium. There's some overlap with Eastern Orthodox relations and the magisterium, especially the papacy. So I sort of transitioned from Eastern Orthodoxy to, well, not converted. I transitioned from studying the field of Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism to studying the papacy, church authority, and reform more intensely. I'm the editor of Faith in Crisis, Critical Dialogues in Catholic Traditionalism, Church Authority, and Reform, as well as The Divine Primacy, which is a book my grandfather wrote, which I brought from being out of print to being uh, republished in 2023 by Emmaus Road Press, or Emmaus Road Publishing, I guess. Um, I've written for the National Catholic Register, Where Peter Is, Catholic Review, and several other outlets. But yeah, mostly focusing on the papacy and reform nowadays.
Great. So I thought a good question to start with was, how did you become Catholic? Were you always Catholic, or was there like a moment where you found the church where you thought
Mhm.
like this is it? What was that like?
Yeah. So I was born and raised Catholic. I had a short period of about 5 years where I drifted away from the faith in my teens. I came back basically as soon as I moved to Baltimore from upstate New York. That was when I sort of started living on my own, and I found a good church community here in Baltimore, and resumed practicing my faith in a more holistic way than I'd ever done in my younger years. And I think a lot of the reason I fell away was because I knew what the faith taught, but I didn't understand the reasons for why it taught it or how it all worked. So when I came back, I had a very um, intense period of study of the questions of the faith. The moment of my reversion was sort of, I don't want to say it was a feeling, but it kind of was. I didn't have a lot of peace um, being apart from the faith, and when I finally reverted, I stumbled into a chapel one day just to get out of the rain, actually. And I had this overwhelming sense of peace that was basically, it just flooded my whole person. And that was my journey back. That started it.
So my next question was going to be, what inspired you to write about it, to put these books together, starting with the Divine Primacy and then Faith in Crisis.
Yeah. So I had a pretty strong relationship with my grandfather throughout my childhood. He lived in the town nearby, just 10 minutes away from where I grew up. Um, I lived with him for a couple of years. My last couple of years in New York, I lived with him before I moved down to Baltimore. So I think that was instrumental in really addressing some of my disagreements with what I'd been taught. I My parents were well intentioned, but um, they couldn't always provide me with the reasons for why they practiced what they did. And I was a very curious, intellectually driven youth. Um, so living with my grandfather, I think, was much more beneficial to the intellectual side of things. And um, following the move from New York down to Baltimore, I think, prepared to dive in more fully. Um, as far as the editing goes, I had, well, everyone had a long stretch of time from the beginning of 2020 to around 2021 or so. So one of my COVID projects was to take my grandfather's books from being out of print, and find some publishing houses who would bring them back into print. Um, it ended up being a lot longer of a project than I expected, and now it's turned into a full-fledged career almost. But it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot and made a lot of connections, and um, it's been good.
Great. So specifically, faith in crisis. Could you tell us a little bit about the topics that it covers and um, why those topics spoke to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as I was going through this project of republishing my grandfather's works, one of his works titled "The Pope, the Council, and the Mass" came to my attention, and I read it from cover to cover, and I realized that the arguments that it presented were still being sort of there were a lot of issues in the church regarding liturgy and papal authority that were answered in the book, but were still creating a lot of confusion in the present. And it was like I thought if people heard these arguments, a lot of their concerns would be resolved. So I tried to republish that book, and um, there were some disagreements about who would write the foreword and some other technical details of publishing. So unfortunately, that one never got republished, but I wanted to pick up where my grandfather left off. So my book is sort of a continuation of his. It answers not so much the liturgy question in particular, but covers a lot of the same themes of church authority in the present. So, how indefectibility works, how the papacy functions in collaboration with the Curia and the College of Cardinals and the bishops, um, what dissent means, how you can um, resolve tensions, theological tensions, without falling into error or heresy in the process. And then the overall attitude that Catholics should cultivate towards authority, especially in light of things like the sex abuse scandal, which have sort of shattered that uh, previous notion of obedience and respect for the magisterium.
Yeah. How do you think the attitudes have changed over the last couple of decades?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question because there's a few factors that go into it. The biggest one is, I think, the media environment. There's a lot of clickbait, a lot of sensationalism, and the Catholic ecclesial scene online ultimately resembles the secular media scene where people are divided into camps, right and left. Um, the motivation for producing an article um, or taking a stand on an issue is often politicized. It's often done for the sake of getting clicks, and it's it often dispenses with the um, traditional guidelines for how Catholics uh, should relate to the magisterium, how they should express criticism or um, uh, raise concerns, stuff like that. Um, so that's one of the factors. And then as I was reviewing my grandfather's legacy, I noticed that a lot of my grandfather became somewhat famous because he had addressed Humanae Vitae and the dissent that arose sharply afterwards in the 70s and 80s. Um, but and a lot of the reaction on the opposite side. So Charles Curran and Hans Kung were considered very liberal, progressive dissenters, and there was a reaction to that on the right, sort of to try to excise that from the church. But in the process, somewhere, um, the far right or the reactionary sort of tendency within the church um, started to fall into the same errors of private interpretation of the magisterium and trying to hold to the tradition in opposition to um, the reforms that were taking place. So it's so my book is an attempt to sort of draw the parallels between the um, dissent that happened in the 70s and the reactionary um, dissent that's happening today, which is sort of just the pendulum swinging the other direction.
Mhm.
That's a
Um,
basic overview.
mhm. What's your advice for young people specifically? How can we navigate that like online space, and how can we prevent the polarization that's happening?
Yeah, it's tough. I think the first thing is just simply be aware that it's happening. Um, it- Also know yourself and know your own tendencies because it's easy to side with th let me put it this way. The algorithms used by social media are tailored to your own personal prejudices and political leanings and um, what you like or share, um, you'll be given more of that through the algorithm. So it creates a sort of echo chamber, and there's not really any critical interaction with a lot of the sources because in addition to the algorithm creating bias, there's also the phenomenon of these short second, like 10 to 30 second clips, which leave out a lot of context and are tailored specifically to um, create a reaction. So being aware of that and then being reflective in the way you engage with social media is, I think, the biggest thing. And being able to draw yourself out of um, know yourself well enough so you can examine your own tendencies dispassionately and critically engage your own views while considering the other side of things. That's important. Also, talking to people you know you disagree with in a way that's non-combative. Um, Prayer is obviously helpful, and um, I would say the advice that the Catechism gives us for rash judgment is very pertinent. So it says, always be ready to give a more favorable interpretation to someone else's words than an interpretation that derives from suspicion um, or that sort of thing. Cynicism also.
Yeah, I think it's really important to engage with the other side for sure, like constantly.
Yeah.
Um, and my other question after that was, how did your perspectives change before the book and then after?
Yeah. Well, hmm. I guess I could give a little um, overview of like my journey through traditionalism. So when I first came into the church, I was very passionate, and this passion began to be channeled into a sort of rigorism. So it was focused on like proselytizing constantly, um, being very like putting all my devotions not just first and foremost, but like being almost obnoxious about them, um, disrupting my work schedule and um, sort of just being imbalanced in general with the way I pursued them. Um, I've always been pretty good about like having a robust prayer life, but at some points early on, it was like I had to pray like 4 to 10 rosaries a day, or like I had to pray multiple different types of chaplets, or it was mass every day, or sometimes twice a day if I could. Um, it it was pretty intense, and I kept that up for a long time. And naturally, I was led to believe that a lot of stuff happening in the Novus Ordo was an abuse. So things like communion being received on the hand, using extraordinary ministers for Holy Communion, female altar servers, um, practices which the church allowed, but which I had been conditioned by other really zealous Catholics to believe were abuses. And that was a very unhealthy disposition that was being fostered in me. And it made me critical of authority. Initially, I was very critical of Pope Francis, even John Paul II at times, because of what he did at Assisi before I really understood the church's um, goals with interreligious dialogue and ecumenism. Um, and so I had these tendencies towards this kind of extremism and believing that what the church had allowed was in contradiction to the tradition. And it was only my subjective interpretation of tradition, because I later realized that a lot of what I was criticizing, like communion standing and receiving in the hand, or uh, using the vernacular broadly, or um, whatever it was, these a lot of these practices were either sourced directly from the early church, or had been reviewed and given sufficient attention within the literature um, to be responsibly reintegrated or integrated for the first time into the liturgy. So when I read my grandfather's book on the Pope, the Council, and the Mass, um, it sort of it created a complete 180 in me almost, where I finally understood. I had a lot of these concerns, and the people around me had the same concerns. And the book just like one by one systematically addressed each one, because a lot of the concerns that people today have were the same ones my grandfather addressed. And his book came about initially because people were submitting questions to the organization he led. It was an apologetics organization called Catholics United for the Faith. Um, the questions and then the responses that were given created the basis for the book. So the book it's not just one person's response, it's a whole organization's collective response to multitudes of um, concerns being submitted to them and then systematically um, analyzed and responded to. So I tried to take the same approach with my own book. I I reflected for a long time about what the issues were that traditionalists were concerned with, why they were concerned about these things, and what the church has to offer in response. So it took quite a bit of re research, um, but it's a very comprehensive response. I tried to be as non-polemical as possible, um, because I do want to continue this tradition of reflectively responding to concerns to bring greater unity in the church.
Yeah, I think there's so many concerns that we have. And sometimes, they can just be um, our subjective understanding of things. But sometimes the concerns are genuine.
Hmm.
Um, and I got a question about how can we bring these up to our parishes or our
Hmm.
dioceses or our spiritual directors in a way that's respectful
Hmm.
and still submitting to authority, but making our voices heard.
Hmm. Yeah. So I would say that the way to do that primarily is through the principle of subsidiarity. We have to find out what the most local response we can have is. So first, that might be research. And then after we've done the research, maybe we present it to the pastor. If the pastor can't help us, maybe we need to consider going to a different parish or escalating those concerns, if they're grave, to the responsible diocesan office. Um, Now, it can go up the chain until it reaches Rome, um, potentially, but the best thing we can do is to be respectful and deferent, um, and also clear about what what our concerns, um, why our concerns are valid in light of what the church teaches.
Mhm. Yeah. In relation to that, another question was how can we navigate when like church leaders say things that we might think ourselves are contradictory to the magisterium? How do we um, figure out the right answer? Like, what resources can we use?
Hmm.
Who can we talk to? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I think I think it comes down first of all to having a natural disposition to trust the magisterium, because ultimately, if you don't trust the magisterium, then whatever answer they give you won't be sufficient. Um, so that's first. The the primary source for finding out what the church teaches is the catechism. If you need a more in-depth um, explanation, there is a source book connected to the catechism, which gives the citations for all of the catechism passages. Um, and it's just basically a commentary on the catechism. There's the Code of Canon Law, of course. Um, and then there's also source books like Denzinger and Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, um, and other source books to see how doctrine has developed over the ages and what the early councils said. Um, and then also, of course, you can just go to the Vatican website, and thankfully they've updated it a little bit, but they usually have documents on any number of questions you might have. So
Yeah,
that's
I think
that's where I'd start.
yeah, those are good sources. I think those are all of the questions about like um, reform and tradition and church authority. Does
Hmm.
anyone have any more questions about that? No. So I think we can move on to ecumenism. Why
Hmm.
why ecumenism is important. Um,
Sure.
so I wanted to ask, like, do you know what inspired? I know your grandfather. He's a Orthodox convert.
Mhm.
So obviously that had probably a lot to do with why he wrote about what he wrote.
Mhm.
Um, but what was his I guess his what's the word I'm looking for? Intention in writing about this topic of ecumenism, and why do you think it's an important thing to continue
Yeah.
approaching?
So my grandfather converted prior to Vatican II. So that has something to do with his approach. Um, he's maybe a little bit more polemical than some ecumenists today, but some would say that's a good thing because he's not, he doesn't lend himself easily towards relativism and watering down of the faith. Um, that's a risk with some forms of ecumenism. However, at Vatican II, Patriarch Athenagoras and Paul VI lifted the mutual excommunications of each other and started the church on this path of really doubling down on ecumenism and restoring the unity that we had in the early church. Um, as long as we're separated, it seems there's a clear split between Christians of various sorts, and that that really harms our witness to the secular world, especially when Christianity in general is supposed to be about communion with one another. Um, Communion is basically like it's one of the major themes of our religion. So when we don't practice that, it's pretty bad. Um, so my grandfather converted during college. He spent a lot of time in the library, reading the works of Newman and Aquinas and um, Christopher Dawson, just examining history. He was a history nerd, I would say. Um, his he went to Elmira College and well, Buffalo and then Elmira. And he got his master's in history. So that was the approach he took, was mostly historical. Um, his first book, Ending the Byzantine Greek Schism, was initially a translation of Thomas Aquinas's Contra Aurores Graecorum, which was against the Greeks. Um, Eventually, he supplemented that with further chapters and appendices in the second edition. And then he wrote his autobiographical account of his journey from Eastern Orthodoxy, and that's called Eastern Orthodoxy in the See of Peter. And then his third book was a collection of letters and replies to a former Catholic, Michael Welton, who wrote the popular Eastern Orthodox apologetic Two Paths. So um, each book takes a different shape, but they all are pretty um, well. At least Divine Primacy is fairly comprehensive. It addresses almost every um, claim that Eastern Orthodox bring up, and then the autobiography is really just how it related to his own faith journey, how he addressed those claims.
Yeah, and then what are your what is the mission of this foundation that you created? Do you want to first like introduce the
Yeah,
foundation a little bit?
sure. So the Likoudis Legacy Foundation was built to um, first consolidate my grandfather's works into a single location, and then to eventually build upon his work. So we've started an academic journal. Um, we've developed a fellows program in the hopes that the fellows can present papers at conferences, um, and those papers will eventually be included in the journal. and then also to create courses and either courses about the work my grandfather covered or to extend that into new forms, usually forms of digital media. Um, so that's the basic answer of what the foundation does. But our core pillars are um, fostering Christian unity, promoting interreligious harmony through dialogue primarily, and upholding the principles of religious freedom and human dignity, which are at threat in a lot of places, but um, without without which you can't foster effective dialogue.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, what is your advice for someone who's just starting in this field of ecumenism? How can we prevent from making it worse, making the division worse,
Mm,
but also prevent relativism?
yeah. Well, I think it was Ratzinger who said this. I'm not positive, but in order to foster effective dialogue, you need to be true to your identity. So wholesome dialogue would never compromise on what you believe. Um, it might be able to make compromises in how that is expressed in a dialogical setting or how how during during things like interfaith prayer or um, collaborative works, you relate to other Christians um, without a triumphalist attitude. And this is a more practical detail, but um, in your interactions with other Christians, you need to establish this mutual trust and mutual respect. Um, and to do so, you need to not just understand what you believe yourself, but also respect the other person's beliefs and not try to impose or coerce your beliefs on them, because everyone has to come to the truth in a way that is, um, how do I say it? It's through their own understanding, building upon what they already know to be true. Now you can help someone purify their beliefs of things that aren't logical or things that, interior contradictions in their beliefs. But you wouldn't say your beliefs are wrong and you need to believe this, or if it's a deeply held belief, it should be approached with respect and sort of it can be questioned or reframed, um, or sort of they can be gradually led to something higher, um, using like the seeds of the gospel or the Semina Verbi or the rays of light that Vatican II talks about. Um, but the fundamental approach is respect. Um, and dialogue in general is meant not just to convert. Um, Dialogue is not technically evangelization, but it's a precursor to evangelization. It's meant to establish mutual understanding.
It's true. Um, I think those are all the questions that I had. Do you guys have any questions about feminism? No. Um, yeah, I think those were all the topics that I had. Did you want to discuss something else?
Um, I'm curious if anyone has any questions regarding the liturgy or particular reforms, maybe of Pope Francis's pontificate or Pope Leo's, or um, any questions about authority functions, like the difference between ordinary or extraordinary magisterium or infallibility and indefectibility or anything.
I actually don't know what the ordinary and extraordinary is. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So in extraordinary magisterium is the most narrow version. Um, when the Pope makes an act ex cathedra, it's a definitive act, and it's also he's invoking the Holy Spirit to protect himself and the exercise of the Church's teaching organ from heresy and error. Um, infallibility can also happen outside of ex cathedra definitions when the ordinary and universal magisterium is invoked. So this would be the Pope coming together with the College of Cardinals, or the College of Bishops, or the bishops in general, I should say, not the college necessarily, but when they make a definition or a decree in a solemn fashion, that can also be infallible. And finally, when the magisterium, even in an ordinary capacity, repeats something that has been taught over the centuries in a way that further entrenches it in the church's teaching and does so in a way that is um, of enough weight, maybe in an encyclical, um, that would exclude the possibility of overturning that teaching in the future. So these three functions um, invoke the charism of infallibility, which was defined at Vatican I in Pastor Eternus. Um, and then along with infallibility, there's also the charism of indefectibility, which is to say that maybe not everything that the Pope teaches is infallible or immune from every error, but it's to say that everything that the Church teaches or anything the Pope teaches formally, which is the equivalent of what the Church teaches, is protected at least from heresy, because if not, then the faithful have no recourse to um, correct for that.
Mhm. Um, do you have any resources for understanding these terms, especially in the earlier councils where things like this weren't necessarily outlined too clearly? So it's kind of hard to understand um, the differences between those claims and other claims are that you can not reverse but
Hmm.
expand upon or sometimes maybe reverse.
Yeah.
Um, I'm thinking things like the situation with Galileo or the situation with
Hmm.
um, uh, Dioscorus in like the 400s,
Hmm.
where he was excommunicated for Christology, and then a couple decades, I think it was in the 60s, we had a joint declaration that the Christology that like the Oriental Orthodox Church is not necessarily heretical.
Yeah.
How can we learn more about how to decipher these terms in the early church?
Yeah. Let me show you a book I have here, if I can find it. Well, here's one of them. So this is considered a pretty solid source. I don't know if you can read it, but it says The Development of Dogma, a systematic account. This is by Guy Mancini, OSB. He's the chair of theology at Ave Maria University. He also wrote a book called simply Ecclesiology. So he deals with a lot of these issues. The other source I would mention, which isn't my own book, but because we also do cover these topics, would be I think it's called The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II. Um, Let me let me see if I can find it real quick. Okay, yeah, The Disputed Teachings of Vatican II, Continuity and Reversals in Catholic Doctrine. That's by Thomas Guarino.
Okay.
Now, I don't take the same approach as Guarino because I don't think doctrine can be reversed necessarily, but I think that there's a filtering that occurs in history that separates out the substance of a teaching from its contingent or historical elements, which could, in theory, result in what looks like a contradiction without it being a substantial contradiction. So the substance remains the same and there's no substantial disagreement, but there may be a disagreement in how it's expressed or in more minor aspects. The other really good source for understanding how the hermeneutic, which is a lens for how to view contradictions, would be the 2005 Christmas address to the Roman Curia of Pope Benedict the 16th. He goes through how it's actually been misunderstood by a lot of theologians in recent years. They call it the hermeneutic of continuity, what he expressed, but in fact, he never used that term. He actually called it the hermeneutic of reform, which he says it's a hermeneutic of reform um, in the continuity of the one subject church. So the continuity that people attribute to this phrase is continuity of the church itself through time, um, not the not continuity in all aspects. And in the same address, Pope Benedict talks about how this hermeneutic of reform includes both continuity and discontinuity at different levels. So again, continuity in the substance of the faith, discontinuity perhaps in how it's expressed or in contingent details, or perhaps disciplines, because disciplines can also be changed over time. And um, that's not considered a reversal of teaching. It's just considered a change.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Sure
Um,
thing.
any more questions?
Favorite Bible story and why?
Favorite Bible study and why?
Story.
Story.
Oh, Bible story.
Yes.
Hmm, that's a good question. I really like the story of Jonah because he tries to get away from what he needs to do and he ends up doing it anyway. And I think I think that it's just a very hopeful story. It seems like maybe it's not so hopeful. He gets swallowed by a whale and has to go to this place he doesn't want to be, but um, it's hopeful in the sense that God's providence wins out in the end, despite Jonah's stupidity and um, short-sightedness.
Very relatable, I think.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Any more cool facts about the Pope or the Vatican? Because you definitely study a lot, so you would know more cool facts that we probably don't know.
Cool facts. Uh, I don't know. I don't know. Cool facts. Um, Elizabeth probably knows more cool facts than I do. But I think it's interesting. There have been a lot of the time in the early ages of the papacy was sort of handed on through families. Um, there was a lot of, or at least like the Pope would appoint his cousins as cardinals or something. There have been, I'm pretty sure this is correct, but you don't need to be a cardinal or bishop to be elected pope. You can even be a layperson. You just have to be a male, baptized male. Um, and eventually you'll be ordained and whatnot. But uh, that's a little interesting, little known fact. And then also, in order to be a cardinal, you don't have to be a bishop or ordained at all. So you can be a lay cardinal.
I didn't know
Yeah. Well, it
that.
doesn't happen anymore, but it used to.
Mhm. I don't know if this is true because I'm not there, like um, time wise. I'm focusing on the first 400 years right now. But I heard people say that at some point there were three popes at the same time. I don't know if
So
that's
this is an interesting one that comes up a lot. So there were three claimants to the papacy. One of them was real and two of them weren't. Um, and ultimately, in order to resolve that dispute, they all had to resign and a new one was elected.
okay.
But there were even some saints who followed the anti-popes, like Saint Vincent Ferrer was one. Um, but this is something that comes up in modern debates all the time. It's like, is Francis an anti-pope or is Leo an anti-pope? Some people will say that because they don't agree with their policies or politics. But keep in mind that in order for there to be an anti-pope, there has to be an authentic pope. You can't just have an anti-pope for decades without a real pope existing at the same time. Um,
That's a good point.
yeah, and then someone's an authentic pope because they went through the process of being elected by the cardinals and received by the church. Sedevacantists claim all the time that the post-conciliar popes aren't true popes, but the papacy is a visible institution that Christ promised will last in perpetuity. So it can't happen that there can be no pope for such an extended period of time, or that uh, well, I mean, there's the period between a pope's death and the next pope's election where the see can be vacant. But if there's someone who claims to be pope who went through the process, there's no way that that person can't be the pope. It's what's called a dogmatic fact. If someone's gone through that process, it's written into law that they are the pope, and there's no way of sort of it's not legitimate to doubt that without also denying dogma.
Yeah, that's true. Um, any more questions? No? All good? Okay. We don't have any more questions over here.
Okay.
Thank you for coming. It was
Yeah.
great. Learned a lot. Uh,
Thanks.
so I think I'll stop recording and then